Hi, it's Darren from SimNation again. Just want to do a quick recap video for Draft Day Sports College Football 2023's League SNCFL. This is SimNation's only Draft Day Sports College Football 2023 League. And of course, the software title is from Wolverine Studios. I encourage you to take a look at it. It's a really good game. Um, I was asked a question about when we would adopt Draft Day Sports College Football 2024. Of course, it's not out, so we can't adopt it. But generally speaking, we will adopt the newest version uh, as soon as the season we're in ends. So if it comes out in late summer, we should probably be wrapping up the season right around then, anyways. If I know it's within a week or two, we may park the league and wait for it. Mostly just because we always want to be on the latest version. I think Brooks and them probably are starting the development cycle on some of the new features and things they want to do. I would openly encourage you to, once first access happens, to get in there and give your feedback. Brooks and team have always been good. I think Asgore, or as we knew him in SimNation, OK Bandit, is still doing a lot of development for them, and I think this is just a solid title, and it'll remain solid as long as you get feedback. But the short answer is it all depends on where we are in the season and when it releases. If it's close to the end of the season, yeah, we'll adopt it almost immediately. If we've already started the season, I may consider switching during the season, but I haven't done that before, so it likely just means we would wait until the season ends before we did it. Um, Now, into what has happened within SNCFL. Of course, between now and the last video, or the last video now, we've had conference championships, we've had bowl games, and we've had the first round of the playoffs. There were some shocks in the conference championship. I have that screen up in front of me now, so we'll talk about that real quick. So Miami versus NC State. I think the only shock here is I thought the game would be a little bit closer. Kudos to Van at NC State. Phenomenal season. We'll talk a little bit more about them shortly. But Gary, with his Miami juggernaut, has done very well this season, and of course they are the ACC champion. Houston versus East Carolina. This one was always going to be Houston. There's the only team I think in the American Athletic that can actually really compete with Houston is Central Florida, and of course they had a down year this year. So Houston just thumped East Carolina, largely done with a very balanced attack. Houston's going to make some noise in the playoffs. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The Big 12 championship, Kevin is at Texas. It's his first season. Frankie has had Oklahoma State off and on. I think it's his second season now back at Oklahoma State. Um, I think we all kind of knew this one was going to be close, and it turned out to be very close. Uh, Goldman had a pretty strong game for Texas, but McDougal was a little bit too much to handle for Texas, and of course Oklahoma State wins a close one and wins the Big 12 championship, and in doing so knocked Texas out of the playoffs and ensured that Oklahoma made it in. And we'll talk more about that in a second. The Big Ten championship, this probably was a no-brainer. There's no universe in which Wisconsin was going to hang with Maryland, and of course Maryland just thumped them 52-20, largely on the arm of Witten and the legs of Bittner, who is just a phenomenal sophomore wide receiver. You'll probably definitely see him in the WWPF, and of course Witten has been playing with a chip on his shoulder since he was injured early on the year, and he's also trying to get into the WWPF. And just so everyone knows, WWPF is a Draft Day Sports Pro Football League that we have here at SimNation. Western Michigan versus Bowling Green, a lot closer than anybody thought, and kind of shocked that Bowling Green kept it close. I expected this just to be a sacrificial lamb to Western Michigan and Stewart, who's coached that team really well. But in the end, the stronger team did win, which was Western Michigan, largely on the legs of Tran. But Gatlin, Bowling Green made it really hard for him. In the Pac-12 championship, UCLA throttled Washington State earlier in the year. This is not a good matchup for Washington State, and UCLA downed them again. you could say is largely on the hands and feet of Hood, who had 4 catches for 170 yards, 2 touchdowns. That's pretty phenomenal. But Merriman had a good game. He's had a good season for Washington State with 188 yards and 2 touchdowns. But again, these two teams are going to meet again because of what happened in the playoffs in round one. So it'll be Washington State's third attempt to try to get past UCLA. I didn't expect LSU to actually beat Florida. Florida's SOA. LSU, of course, is my team. But a pretty solid defensive outing for LSU. They shut down Florida's offense. The game was probably a little bit more close than the score reflects, but Bach had a strong game, and then of course the rushing attack for LSU was one of the big differences in this one as they just slowed the game down. Great season for LSU. I don't think you would have thought that LSU was going to be here. Florida's a little bit of a shock because most people would have thought Georgia would be there, but of course Georgia had an up and down season. Uh, no shock in the Mountain West. Colorado State was the team to beat, and they just thumped Nevada. Uh, Belcher had a decent game, but that Colorado State team is a hard team to face. Arkansas State upset New Mexico State. If you remember, New Mexico State's been ranked most of the season, and it looked like that they were going to be the odds-on favorite to win the Sun Belt. And Arkansas State came in behind their quarterback Bun and definitely took the game away from them. Despite a late comeback attempt from New Mexico State, because bear in mind they were 31 to 7 going into the fourth, and they got within 7 at the end. Conference USA, this one was largely going to be Marshall always, but North Texas made it a really close game, and in the end, though Marshall was a little bit too much for him. So, what did that mean for the playoffs? So, playoff wise, a couple teams dropped, a couple teams moved up. Um, Going into this game, Florida was in, Texas was in, um, and I think Wisconsin was in. But all three of those teams needed to win the game in order to stay in. And because they lost, it allowed Utah to move up. It also allowed NC State to have some buffer for a drop. And of course, Marshall moved up as well. And as a result, Texas A&M, Georgia were right on the cusp of making the playoffs because again, it's a top 16, right? But they just fell a little bit short and ended up going to bowl games, which Texas A&M, of course, is a CPU team, a really good CPU team, by the way. So if you want to join our league, this is a good team to take. Georgia is, of course, Shark, and he came really, really close. But what it meant at the top is there really wasn't a change. Maryland was the number one seed going in, left as the number one seed. UCLA would get the 2. They were at 2 already. LSU, I think, may have moved up to 3. Western Michigan 4, Miami 5, Oklahoma 6, Michigan 7, Houston 8. So what that meant is Maryland would play Utah in the first round. UCLA would play Colorado State. LSU would play NC State. Western Michigan would get Oklahoma. Not a really good matchup for Western Michigan, by the way. Miami would get Ohio State. Oklahoma State would get Marshall. Michigan would get Washington State. And by this point, Stuart and I are probably sick of playing each other because that's one of his teams and one of my teams. And then Houston and Florida State would square off. But before we go there, let's look at the bowls real quick. And I mean, you can already see some of the results because it's on the news. So for transparency, I have to rename the bowls. When we first adopted 2023, I had to reset them, and I forgot to go back and set them back. So we'll be doing that this season as well as some other cosmetic fixes. In the Wheat Bowl, it was Texas versus Georgia. So this is Kevin versus Shark. And Shark, of course, won this one. Um, he was trailing with like 2 minutes left, and then got a really good drive going. And then Noah, who didn't have a great game, but a good enough game, won it for them despite Goldman having a pretty good game. And of course, in fairness to Texas, they were without their star running back who was injured. In the Nacho Bowl, Stanford versus Florida. So this is Skelter versus Soa. Uh, and of course, Skelter's probably a little saucy right now because Florida edged out Stanford. I think I would have called this one as a Florida win, even though Skelter's a phenomenal coach. Florida just has a better team. And that was reflected with Newman with 291 yards and 4 touchdowns. This was a really good game. This is Van versus Shark. This is one of Shark's low prestige teams. Van is, of course, Washington is his second team. And really close game, won in the fourth, if I remember correctly. We'll look at that real quick. Um, well, it was really one before then. It was one in the fourth because Iowa State scored the 2 touchdowns and then Washington tried to come back. Uh, Washington, Kamal had a really good game, but on the opposite side, Landry for Iowa State had a phenomenal game, and that's what helped them win it. Excuse me. If I remember correctly, I think Virginia actually has an owner now, and just want to look that up real quick to make sure. So this would be LA Smog, um, and I apologize, I should have looked this up before, but yeah, Starfinder took over Virginia, and this is LA Smog versus Starfinder. Um, West Virginia's had a pretty good year. Virginia had a good year, mostly on CPU, but in the end, West Virginia wrapped up a pretty decent first year for LA Smog, uh, largely on the ground. They went into overtime, and West Virginia won it. And if you look at that, Virginia tied it up late in the game, and then of course one got a field goal, the other one got a touchdown, and that normally is how uh, I just in real life, I'm a big proponent of almost always going for the touchdown in overtime as opposed to trying to go for the field goal. It's controversial, and most people say you take whatever points you can get. But the problem I have with that is if you go first and you kick the field goal, you got to hope that they don't score a touchdown. And it's kind of like going for it on 4th and 1 a lot or not punting. Now, I do believe in punting, but there's just some aspects of the game where when you think about it, it's better to take the risk than not take the risk. And for transparency, I tend to be a more aggressive coach. Um, Louisiana Monroe played Indiana great football. This is not where Skelter wanted to be with the Louisiana Monroe at the beginning of the season. But Ashby, who's just had a phenomenal year at running back, he should win the Doak Walker, even though Merriman scored a ton of touchdowns. I think Ashby's had a more solid season. But Skelter just beat up on them, taking out his grief. This was Frankie versus a really good CPU team. Iowa's Frankie's other team. And he won a very close one. Um, Vanderbilt just had a phenomenal year, though not the Vanderbilt of real life. So good job, Frankie, with getting a win and hopefully getting Iowa on the right track. This is Skelter versus the Cinderella Arkansas State team who won the Sun Belt. Boise State has been on a tear ever since Skelton started his rushing attack there, but as you can see, it was not just the rushing attack, there was a good pass attack as well. So Har and Gray were 2 stars in that game. This was Starfinder versus Alabama. BYU's had a really good season, but Alabama's still a top team. And by the way, they are an open team, so if you're interested in them, they're one of the better teams in the SEC along with Auburn. Tennessee versus Louisiana Lafayette. So this is Udo versus a CPU team. Tennessee had a pretty down year, but at least Udo should be happy going out as a winner. Uh, just an up and down year for Tennessee, just like Georgia. But Udo will get that corrected, and next season Tennessee should be good to go. Georgia Southern versus Baylor. So this is Huston versus DWK. DWK, of course, won this one. I'm sorry, lost, but he put up a really, really good game. The thing with Baylor is they are a long passing attack, so if you shut that out, you should have some good things. But that's a really good showing for Georgia Southern against what is a top team from a talent perspective. So came really close to winning it. Just kind of curious. Yeah, they definitely had a spirited comeback and went for the two and didn't get it, but just a good season and all for Georgia Southern. Cable had a down year with Central Florida. Uh, Not gonna. I don't think that's gonna be indicative. I think they'll bounce back next season, mostly just because they're dealing with the loss of McCulloch and Central Florida didn't have a lot of great tools behind McCulloch. So when he graduated, it made it for a little bit harder for Central Florida this season. Penn State versus South Alabama. This is DWK versus CPU. Penn State definitely came on late in the season. They continued that trend. So I think DWK's got them on a pretty good trajectory. So they should make some noise. Of course, unfortunately, they are in probably the toughest division in the game, uh, where you have Maryland, Ohio State, and Michigan all in that East division of the Big Ten. Other big games, I'm not happy that Texas Tech made it to the Lone Star Bowl. Um, they showed up decently considering how bad their offense has been. Keys had a really good game. This was Shelley's last game at running back, and of course, he had over 1,600 yards on the season. After this game, I'm probably going to do a video on Texas Tech because I cut half of the team after this, mostly because I think I can get anybody better than what I have. And then the last human game was Arizona State versus Hawaii. So this is Gary's other team. Arizona State easily won this one, largely on the ground, but great showing. So with the playoffs in mind, there were some upsets. We'll go downhill. So in the first round, not an upset, but Maryland just completely destroyed Utah. 77-17 is not something you want to see in the playoffs. Um, Brewer, who is a really good quarterback at Utah, just got shut down. Maryland's passing defense is, generally speaking, if you want to beat Maryland, you don't want to pass the ball against them. They have probably the best secondary in the game. Uh, but what really struck me about this game is Leo Vang, who is Maryland's freshman running back. The first 8 touchdowns by Maryland were all scored by Vang. So he had 7 rushing touchdowns and a passing reception touchdown. So just a phenomenal game for Vang, who's had a great season in his first year at Maryland. Um, this game was closer than I thought it would be. I did think Colorado State would put some points up on uh, UCLA, and if you look at the fourth quarter, you suddenly realize that Colorado State was actually leading at one point. Uh, but UCLA is a phenomenal team. Stewart's a phenomenal coach, and Scholl is going to probably be in the WWPF next year. He's that good of a quarterback, and definitely led them to the win. This kind of hurts on so many different levels, but Van and NC State thumped LSU. LSU just did not show up to this one, and Van's defense did a phenomenal job of making sure that they didn't show up. So kudos to Van. I don't lose 55-10 very often, but I definitely got my ass kicked in this one. And he did it on the ground. I knew he was going to do it on the ground, and I thought I had a solid plan to shut down his rushing attack while still getting my offensive going, and neither of my plans worked, and it just ended badly. Uh, this one probably stings Stewart a little bit, but Steve's probably really happy. Steve's at Oklahoma, Stewart's at Western Michigan. Uh, the game was actually really close going into the fourth quarter. It was a 7-point game. And remember, at the end of the first half, Western Michigan was actually leading. But then Oklahoma just completely destroyed Western Michigan in the second half. I mean, they scored 36 points to 7. And a lot of that was done through the air. Stone came in for an injured Feldel. And then, of course, Avery, who's just a phenomenal running back. The problem with Steve in Oklahoma is you've got to be able to guard both the run and the pass. If you just focus on one of them, he's going to utterly annihilate you. Um, so, good job, Steve. Stewart, uh, probably not the result you wanted to see, but Oklahoma just exploded offensively. Now, of course, their Achilles heel looks like their defense, so you might be able to exploit that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Um, on the flip side, this was DP, who's now back at Ohio State, versus Gary in Miami. Gary came back in the fourth quarter to win this one after trailing most of the game. DP's a little sour, but Gary is one of the more phenomenal coaches, and Miami is a very tough team to play. But they managed to do it behind Beatty in his arm versus DP's quarterback had a good game passing yards wise, but not maybe a good game from a percentage. And in fairness, he was getting sacked a lot because if we go down here and look, Gary just like pulled the Eagles back and went straight after him. Because not only did they have 8 sacks, but they had 4 hurries, what, like 9 knockdowns. That's a team that's blitzing you heavily. So Miami gets the win, ends DP's run. Not a good day for the Big Ten in general. Maryland, I think, is the only team that came out winning. Versus for the Big 12, I think it was a pretty good day. ACC had a good day as well, except for maybe one loss. Oklahoma State, this one was a lot closer than I think anybody thought it would be. But again, Marshall has upset some big teams. I think that they upset Louisiana Monroe earlier in the season. Um, and again, it was McDougal who helped win this game um, for Oklahoma State. Frankie will probably try to adjust his defense a little bit because he's got a pretty hard game coming up. And then this was a little bit of a shocker to me. I did think Washington State had a chance against Michigan. Michigan isn't UCLA. And because I play Michigan at least once a season, I kind of understand them a little bit better than I do other teams. Um, but the shocker here that probably threw Stewart a little bit is I came out throwing. For those you don't know, Washington State will be the example of how to run a running attack. But in this game, I took them to a balanced attack and essentially leaned more heavily towards the pass than the run. And the result was McCauley had his a 300-yard game. That doesn't happen much for him. Thompson had a good game receiving, so did Patterson. But the two running backs still had really good games with over 130 yards each. And then on defense, they were largely able to get turnovers against Michigan, which helped them to down them. And then I this one I actually thought just Sample would win with Florida State. A little shocked to see Houston win it, but it's not too far-fetched to see Houston because again they have a pretty balanced attack. And I think turnovers and penalties probably hurt Florida State a little bit here. And just the fact that Florida State just really couldn't get going in the second half, whereas Houston definitely was going. Asa Garcia had a really good freshman year. He was the former number 1 recruited quarterback. And then, of course, Crouch had a really good game. So what that means is for the second round, which will run on Tuesday, you got Maryland versus Houston. Maryland's probably going to win that one. Um, Maryland matches up very well, and it may feel a little bit more like the Utah game again. UCLA versus Washington State. I don't think Washington State has an answer for UCLA. They've already played them twice. They've lost twice. While Stewart will be on guard, I'm going to have to pull something really strange out to go against him to win that. So I think UCLA is going to win this one. NC State, Oklahoma State. This is going to be a really good game. Van has had a really good year at NC State. The ranking doesn't reflect how good of a year he's had. Oklahoma State is, of course, one of the Big 12 powers, so they're a tough team to match up against, especially since Frankie balances the offense really well and has a good defense most games. Um, I do think that while this will be close, I think Oklahoma State will pull it out, but don't be shocked if Ann wins it. And then in the last quarterfinal game, of course, you have Miami versus Oklahoma. Uh, this one's going to be tough for Gary. If he can shut off the outside running and the long passing game of Oklahoma, he's got a chance. Otherwise, I think Oklahoma takes this, and I think Oklahoma's going to win this one. So unfortunately, I think both of the ACC teams may get bounced in this round, and we'll be left with a Big Ten team, a Pac-12 team, and two of the Big 12 teams. If we look at the bracket, what that means is that if Maryland wins, they will get the winner of the Oklahoma-Miami game, which I'm saying probably is going to be Oklahoma. That's going to be a really, really interesting game. Maryland is probably one of the few teams that matches up well against Oklahoma because they can defend both the pass and the run, and they have one of the best defenses in the SNCFL. But the game planning is going to have to be on point. Steve has just done a really good job with Oklahoma this year. UCLA versus Washington State, that should be UCLA. And if predictions hold true, it would be UCLA versus Oklahoma State. So that'd be Frankie versus Stewart. Um, that one is too close to call. So whatever happens is you could really have an all Big 12 championship game, which would be potentially the championship game that could have been for the Big 12 between Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. It'll be a rematch of Bedlam. That's happened actually before in a previous season when it was Frankie and me, where we not only played each other once during the season, we played in the conference championships and then we played again in the playoffs. Or it could be a Maryland versus UCLA, which would be 3 weeks of Stewart and I playing each other. So three of the four matchups in the playoffs being where Stewart and I played each other. So it'll be interesting to see. My personal prediction is it's probably going to be Maryland versus UCLA. But if it'll be interesting. I think if it's not Maryland versus UCLA, it's going to be Oklahoma versus Oklahoma State. But we'll see how that pans out. What's left in the season is after the playoffs get done, we will have awards, and then we will have the set red shirts, and then we'll flip the season. So if you want to join, it's a perfect time to. You'll be able to get in, and you'll be able to definitely mold your team the way it is. There are a lot of really strong teams still out there that a new coach could come in and take. Just to look at Texas Tech real quick, because I mentioned that. Texas Tech is of course my fourth team, and they are a project team. They're kind of like LSU used to be. But after the loss, I just had enough of a lot of different things with them. As you can see, is they were doing well here, but in fairness, that was the quality of the opponent. Baylor was the only big name opponent that they beat, and that was just because Baylor's single track mind of long passing was something I could exploit, and my offense didn't lose the game for me. But after that, they just really didn't do anything. So I got tired of the offense and I made some pretty hard changes. But I'll talk about that in a different video actually, because this one's going a little bit long. But so playoffs were complete by the next time we talk. And if you want to join the league, definitely take a look. We have a lot of great coaches here. The Slack is typically pretty active. And I would say that there are some definite characters within it. And I just want to say a quick shout out to all the new coaches. So like Steve, LA Smog, DWK to a certain extent, Starfinder, Kevin. Great job this year, guys. Definitely raised the competition of the league. And it made for a very interesting and exciting season. So next season, I get to figure out where Western Michigan is going. I may give them one more year on the MAC while I figure that out. But they've hit a level of prestige that they just need to come out of the MAC because it's becoming an easy cakewalk. And of course, the last team that did that was Louisiana Monroe, who's now in the SEC with Skeltor. Um, the balance of the SEC is helping to balance out Louisiana Monroe a little bit. So we do move teams. Um, we don't hold it true to the actual conferences that are in real life. So if you like this, go ahead and hit like, but otherwise, I will talk to you again soon. Thank you.